Thank you all for joining us this morning. My name is Steve McMenamin, and I'm your host for today's event, which is part of the continuing series of the Greenwich Roundtable. Our topic this morning is part two of our examination of fees. This is not it. This is part two of our examination of investment committee behavior. Excuse me. As luck would have it, we've managed to persuade three of the most knowledgeable, unbiased experts to share their views today. That is on track. In order of the way they will be speaking, Jason Zweig is an old friend of the Roundtable and the investing columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of The Devil's Financial Dictionary, which you'll find in the rotunda as you leave the room today, and Your Money in Your Brain on the Neuroscience of Investing. Jason edited the revised edition of Benjamin Graham's classic, The Intelligent Investor, the classic text that Warren Buffett has described as by far the best book about investing ever written. Jason has served as a trustee of the Museum of American Finance, and he sits on the editorial boards of Financial History and the Journal of Behavioral Finance. Sitting next to Jason, Gary Mottola is the research director of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation and a social psychologist who's been analyzing our business for the last 20 years. In his role at FINRA, he oversees and conducts research projects aimed at better understanding financial capability in America, protecting investors from financial fraud, and improving financial disclosure statements. In sitting next to Gary, Sally Staley is the Chief Investment Officer of Case Western University. She started her career in international bond market research and sales at Solomon and Merrill Lynch. After that, she started and ran the Wisconsin Investment Board's International Fixed Income Program. Sally later worked as senior consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Sally is a trustee of the College of Wooster, where she's currently serving on the investment committee. She's also a board member and investment subcommittee chairperson for Great Lakes Theater Festival, Inc., and a former board member and investment committee chairperson for the St. Luke's Foundation of Cleveland. And today's moderator, John Griswold, is the moderator of the Greenwich Roundtable today. John is the founder of the Common Fund Institute and the chairman of the Roundtable. He's one of the leading authorities in nonprofit governance, and we are lucky to have him. John?
Thanks, Steve. Oh, good. Let's do that. Yeah. Everybody got a mic. Well, good morning, and thank you for coming. I want to thank my panelists for coming as well. As some of my friends know, I came in here rather quickly a few minutes ago because Jason came out from New York. Who would have thought that coming out from New York on a train would be more adventurous than probably getting here from the West Coast this morning. But due to the fire under the tracks in Harlem, we had a little delay. So Jason and I raced over here just in time, and I'm grateful for Jason to make the trek out from the wilds of New York City. As Steve mentioned, this is about investment committees. We've actually had two or three sessions on investment committees. Some of you may remember with Charlie Ellis, Keith Ambershire, Myra Drucker a couple of years ago, discussing the nature of investment committee, not just as teams of groups of people, but as individuals as well. So we have three people this morning who are going to talk about different aspects of behavioral finance and behaviors of investment committees, both as individuals and teams. So just a few comments to start with. The importance of investment committees, of course, is self-evident, but it can be illustrated by a few observations. Under law, of course, committees operate under fiduciary rules, fiduciary duties that are prescribed by law, mostly at the state level or the Uniform Act, Uniform Prudent Management Individual Funds Act, and UPIA, and others. Certainly, committees provide a steady hand on the helm, particularly at stressful times financially. We saw that in many cases during the 2008 Great Recession and bear market. Total assets under control of investment committees can only be estimated, but certainly it's somewhere, from what I was able to find, north of $12 trillion. when you put pensions and other tax-exempt organizations together, along with corporate and union funds and others. So a very large amount of money under the oversight of investment committees in this country, and that's just domestically. These funds provide enormous public benefit. They support our current and future well-being. They provide some of the social safety net that we all count on as a society and a culture. Research has shown also, and we'll talk about this a little further, that groups generally make better decisions than individuals acting alone. But, of course, not all investment committees are effective at providing superior performance. Many suffer from mild to acute dysfunction caused by misbehavior of some sort or other. So today's session will explore the subject of behavioral finance, how individuals and committees behave based on heuristics, a term coined by psychologists to describe simple shorthand rules that humans use to make decisions. The shorthand rules lead to behavioral biases, which often undermine rational decision-making. One outcome of behavioral finance leads to one outcome that Mark Twain observed, quote, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." I want to read one passage from Jason's new book, and you will get a copy of this afterward. This is, as Steve mentioned, The Devil's Financial Dictionary, and I happened to go to a talk that Jason gave at the Museum of Finance a few months ago, I guess now. Yeah. It's a marvelous little book. I think you'll find it. You're all going to get copies, so I think you'll find it entertaining. But his definition of behavioral economics is interesting. The study of how behavioral economics is the study of how human beings make decisions about money, as opposed to traditional or standard economics, which studies how economists think human beings would make decisions about money if all human beings thought the way economists think they do. Behavioral finance is the subdiscipline that looks at how real people make decisions about investing. So with that, I'm going to turn to Jason and ask him to embellish on his definition.
Yeah. John, thank you, and good morning, everyone. My apologies not only for arriving late, but also for making John arrive late. But I think we're all good at this point. Somehow we survived Metro North, and that's a good thing. So I'd like to start just by asking all of you a very quick question, just a show of hands. Who is currently serving on an investment committee in the room? So about half the room, it looks like. Okay, good. So at the risk of annoying my chauffeur, I will. I'd like to modify something John said. Actually, two things. The very complimentary thing Warren Buffett said about the intelligent investor. He said before I edited the book, although I guess he hasn't revised his opinion. But the second thing I wanted to point out is that if I remember right, John, you said there's evidence showing that groups make better decisions than individuals, and that is true. But and I think Gary will agree with me on this. That statement, we can't generalize that too much. The way I would put it is that groups can make better decisions than individuals, not that they necessarily are likely to. And in fact, there's a great deal of research in social psychology and organizational behavior showing that when groups don't work particularly well, they tend to make a lot of the biases of individual decision-making worse, not better. And to just name a few aspects of how this problem can arise, if individuals are overconfident about the quality of their information or the accuracy of their own judgments, when you bring them together into a group, the group will tend to make even more extreme and more overconfident predictions than each of the individuals themselves would tend to make. The sunk cost fallacy tends to be much worse in groups than among individuals. If an organization has made a commitment to a project that is going awry, costing money, failing, underperforming, as a group, they are more likely to stay committed to it well past the time when an objective outsider might pull the plug. Another area where groups tend to be worse than individuals is with what's called the planning fallacy, which I don't think I included in my handout, but the planning fallacy is a pretty simple, well-known bias of human judgment in which when people are forming plans for a complicated or protracted or difficult project, they base their estimates of how long it will take and how much work it will be on their own experience and hopes, rather than on the actual observed experience of other groups or organizations or people who have done similar things, which tends to lead them to make wild underestimates of how long it will take and how much it'll cost. And the simplest way to get the planning fallacy across to anyone is I think we all know that if we're renovating our house, we could ask the contractor, how long will it take and how much will it cost? The contractor will give us an answer, and if we believe the contractor, we're crazy. Because what you should do, of course, is you should say, how long does it take to renovate the average kitchen? And that will usually be twice as long and twice as expensive as what the contractor told you. And I know this from bitter personal experience. And we love our contractor, by the way. He's terrific. But he's always wrong by a factor of 2. So the planning fallacy becomes much worse in groups than it is among individuals. And finally, and I think most troubling for investment committees, confirmation bias seems to become worse in groups than it is among individuals in isolation. And confirmation bias, many of you I think are familiar with the term. It's the human tendency during the information gathering and information processing. It's the tendency to seek out evidence that confirms what you already believe and to ignore or discount information that might prove you wrong. And individuals are prone to that bias to an alarming degree, I think, and groups can be even more subject to it. And if you have any doubt about that, just think for a moment about social media like Facebook or Twitter, where people just pile on with political opinions or economic judgments until it just becomes an echo chamber. So those are some of the individual biases that I think can present severe problems for investment committees as they make decisions. And I think if there were one message I'd like all of you to come away from my remarks with, it's that you should resist the tendency to believe that you're not human. I mean, the really fascinating thing about behavioral economics and behavioral finance is the reminder it should give all of us that these are pitfalls of human judgment. They're not pitfalls of amateur judgment. They're not pitfalls of individual judgment. They're pitfalls of human judgment. And so far as I can tell, everyone in the room is human. And if you're in this room and you're human, you are prone to these biases. and you need to do everything you can to combat them. And actually, John, can I borrow that little red book there?
You bet.
I think I'll just read one definition at the risk of offending some people in the room, because there is something in this book to offend just about everyone. I'll read the definition for sophisticated investor, because I think that applies to everyone. Sophisticated investor, noun, one of Wall Street's favorite oxymorons, the financial equivalent of jumbo shrimp, military intelligence, or United Nations. The term is typically used to describe a high net worth or institutional investor who often deploys millions of dollars at a time. But people are not more sophisticated merely because they have more money. Often, quite the opposite is true, as their own behavior will attest. So, thank you, John. One of the things I found most troubling in the wake of the global financial crisis was the number of sophisticated investors I spoke to who had sworn that they had investment policies in place that were durable and reliable and would see them through the most difficult times, who surreptitiously changed them, typically either in the fourth quarter of 2008 or the first quarter of 2009, and they changed them in a panic. And that's very disturbing, because that is a failure both of individual judgment and of committee judgment, assuming, of course, that they changed it to their subsequent regret, which I think many of them did, based on what I've heard. So that's a quick introduction. I wanted to make 3 suggestions for maybe some policies and procedures that could help. The first is, I think committees tend to do too much in person and not enough in isolation. There's a wonderful essay by Isaac Asimov, and if anybody wants, just give me your card afterwards, and I can send you a link to it. It's online. Where I think it's called "Where Do Ideas Come From?" And in it, Asimov makes the point that creativity is dangerous and uncomfortable and a little crazy. And we know that the 2 most common pressures in a committee atmosphere, and I've been on a board of a nonprofit for many years, are polarization on the one hand, where the group divides into warring camps, or pressure to conform, where there's one charismatic or powerful individual and everyone feels pressure to agree. So you have these 2 opposing forces, either too much pressure to come together or an enormous pull that's dragging people apart. And in either case, those forces are dangerous to dissent, to creativity, because if you do have a differential insight, a unique idea, a different perspective, you will feel pressure either to conform or to pick sides, or you may be silenced. And so I think too many committees do too much face-to-face. A committee that's facing a really important decision, I think, should ask each member to form a thorough, articulate, formal position in isolation. Before the meeting starts, each member should have to form a thorough, written position paper that can then be submitted to the entire group. And that will help surface differing, maybe opposing viewpoints in safety. So I think that's a very important idea. There's a well-known professor at Wharton named Scott Armstrong who believes that committees should barely meet at all for just that reason, that they should make most of their decisions by email or at worst by teleconference. And I'm not advocating that, but I think important decisions should largely be made by taking each individual's best viewpoint without the group pressure of the personal meeting, and then you can discuss it face to face. So that's the first idea. The second is that when you have an extraordinarily important governing document or principle, like an investment policy, for example, I don't mean this merely as a metaphor. I think you should actually do it. I think you should have it inscribed on a little scroll of paper. I think you should wrap it up, much like the mezuzah that religious Jews have on their door frames. And you should put it in a little glass box. And it should say, in case of emergency, break glass. And before each meeting that you do have, you should put the little glass box on the table with a hammer. And anybody who wants to amend the investment policy should have to pick up the hammer and smash the box. And that would not prevent changing the investment policy, but it might have prevented people from changing theirs in, say, November 2008 or March 6th, 2009, not to name any particular dates. Then the third idea is very simple, which is that you can't learn from what you are not measuring. And so often I've heard institutional investors talk about how well their sell discipline works. Well, we're really confident when we fire managers that our process works. And then I'll say, well, do you measure the performance of the managers you fire after you fire them? And I usually get a blank look. And I say, well, how do you know that the manager you hired did better than the manager you fired? And they say, well, the manager we hired did great. I say, but maybe you just fired low. And because of regression to the mean, the manager you fired went on to do better than the one you hired. How do you know? And they say, oh, well, yeah, we'll look into that. And I'm not sure how many of them ever do. So it's very important not just to measure the positive, obvious outcomes, but the other dimensions of your decisions, the ones that otherwise would go unobserved. You need to measure those as well. And that's a really clear example of a way to do it, which is measure how the people you fire do after you fire them. Because the ongoing process of managing managers consists not just of hiring the good ones, but also, obviously, firing the bad ones. You don't know whether the ones you fired are really bad if you don't measure them after you fire them. So, okay. Thank you.
Wonderful, Jason. Thank you. Just let me ask you one question before we move on to Gary. You mentioned the idea of submitting written things. I think it's a terrific idea. But I was curious, you edited Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And that, from talking to you during that time, I know how much work that was.
Yeah.
It must have been absolutely fascinating. Yeah. Was there something that was there one thing that you can remember that he said in that book, or you worked with him on, that you thought was just a really brilliant idea to define how committees, how groups behave versus individuals?
It's a great question, John. Thank you. I think I'll answer you a little with a little bit of misdirection, because there isn't much in the book about group versus individual decision-making per se. But one thing that we did talk about a lot, and that I learned from Danny when we were working on the book, is very important, I think. Those of you who've read the book may remember this anecdote. He tells a story that he calls the illusion of validity. And he and some of his colleagues, he was a psychologist in the Israeli army in the 1950s, and he was evaluating the officer training program. And as many officer training programs in militaries around the world do, the Israeli army then put officer candidates through a variety of sort of physical and mental challenges to see who was made of the right stuff, as the saying goes. And so one of them, the classic, was you had to, I think it was 8 men, and actually even then I think there might have been some women, but it was eight officer candidates had to carry a telephone pole and get it up over the other side of an obstacle wall without the pole ever touching the ground or the wall. And it was an extremely difficult task. It's almost impossible to do. There are some clever solutions that, frankly, I don't remember, that someone who's very good at puzzles can figure out, and then it becomes quite easy. But most people find it nearly impossible. And what Danny talks about is how as they observed these officer candidates trying to perform this task, they formed very cohesive views of each person. Like, this one is a leader, look at him, or that one's a bumbler, or this one's a follower. And so they would make their notes and then their projections on how qualified these candidates were to lead soldiers into battle based on these intuitive, perceptive impressions of people performing these tasks. But when the officers went on to graduate officer school and then to lead troops, what Danny and his colleagues learned is that their assessments were completely unreliable, and that the person who looked like a leader was a failure, and the person who seemed like a bumbler went on to become a colonel or a general. And so he called this the illusion of validity, because our perceptions have this incredible sort of emotional, vivid force that don't really have a lot of predictive power. So why am I telling this story? It's because I think so often when investment committees make hiring decisions about managers, for example, you may well be, excuse me, you may well be under the impression that you're making a decision based on objective quantitative measures, when in fact you're relying much more on your intuition than you might realize. And so the process that Danny recommends, and that we talked about a lot, and he does mention it briefly in the book, is simply putting more structure on the decision. So what you would want to do when you're hiring a manager based on his theory is you would want to come up with maybe 3 to 5 dimensions that you believe determine the quality of an investment manager. It might be, for example, the 5 Ps. It could be whatever you prefer. You might say people, process, performance, etc. And then within each of those, you want to have a set of factors that determine, well, if we're making a judgment on people, what are the factors that we think determine you have good people? And then as you interview the manager, you rate each of those factors on a simple numerical scale, maybe 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. with 5 or 10 is the best and 0 or 1 is the worst, then you would simply take the total of all the numerical scores, and whoever gets the highest score gets hired. And if you like, you could then have a final final category for your overall impression, your subjective impression. Do I like these people or not? But you should equally weight all the factors and just hire whoever gets the highest score. And this keeps your intuition from swamping, it keeps your subjective judgment from swamping your objective judgment. And that kind of structured decision process can be a big help. And I've become a big believer in doing that. I've advised some of my bosses at the Wall Street Journal to hire people that way. And some of them say they're taking that into account. But I think that's a very powerful tool.
Thanks, Jason. Gary.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here to talk about this topic, which is of great interest to obviously a lot of people in the room, and as a social psychologist, very much me. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the effectiveness of group decision-making, which we've already kind of started to step into, build on some of the biases that Jason talked about, and even throw a couple more at you, and then wrap up with five tips to make investment committees more effective. I also work for the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, and at the end I'll just tell you a little bit about the foundation as well. But first to talk about group decision-making, and as Jason alluded to, groups have the potential to make better decisions than individuals, but that potential is not always achieved. And one thing you need to consider is there are different types of tasks, and groups tend to outperform individuals on certain types of tasks, which happen to be the tasks that investment committees tend to face. So, for example, a disjunctive task is a task where you have to come up with one decision, the group has to come up with one decision, like what percent of the portfolio should go towards equities. A compensatory task is one in which actually Jason just alluded to, where you average the inputs from a number of people, and then you go with that decision. Those are the types of tasks that groups outperform individuals on. As you would guess, the other two types of tasks, one is called compensatory. I'm sorry, did I get that right? Let me just check my notes. The other, conjunctive, I'm sorry. Disjunctive is when it's an assembly line where a group will outperform an individual when the people specialize in different areas and you piece something together. And naturally, also when you add the effort. So, like in classic example is a tug of war. A group is going to outperform an individual on tug of war because you're just adding the strength of the individual members. So just keep that in mind, that the types of tasks that investment committees face, groups tend to do better. But we're going to talk, and Jason's already alluded to it, why that's not always the case. So one thing to consider is, why don't groups outperform individuals? I mean, if you think about the advantages that groups have, you have more intellectual resources. You could have lawyers, doctors, psychologists, all on the same investment committee. So that helps in the decision-making process. You also, the actual act of discussion can bring up ideas that an individual won't encounter alone. So these are some of the advantages that groups have. But they do run into problems. And probably the biggest, the big three of theories and biases that I think can affect groups are groupthink, which I'll talk about momentarily, and Jason already hit on the other two, which is group polarization and confirmation bias or overconfidence. But I do want to. Jason also alluded to this notion of, when you fire an investment manager, did you check to see how the investment manager did that you fired and how they did compared to the one you hired? And there actually was a study in 2008 that did just that. They looked at 3,400 plan sponsors of investment committees. So this is in the defined contribution world. And what they found was that the hired managers did no better than the fired managers and actually did a little worse. So this is one of the only robust studies that actually looked pre-post on investment committee decisions. And if you think about the resources that go into the hiring and firing process, that's potentially a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted resources. So kind of with that background, let me just talk a little bit about groupthink. So groupthink, you've probably heard the term, may have even used it, but from an investment committee standpoint, it's important to understand essentially the causes, symptoms, and consequences of groupthink. And I'll just go back to 1962 for a little history lesson here. I'm sure you either remember the Bay of Pigs invasion or you read about it in school, depending on your age. In either case, just to recap it real briefly, President Kennedy, working with a committee in the CIA, planned to invade Cuba, and the invasion, to overthrow the Cuban government. The invasion was a complete failure. All of the attackers either were killed or had to be rescued. And it was a classic fiasco. Well, there was a psychologist at the time named Irving Janis who was just flabbergasted that an ostensibly intelligent committee with all this information at their fingertips could make such a bad decision, and he began to investigate group decision making. And groupthink was the theory that emerged from it. So, in a nutshell, groupthink is essentially, it occurs when the group is more interested. First of all, it usually occurs in cohesive groups that are more interested in unanimity than they are in realistically appraising the alternatives they have before them. I'm old, so I have to actually flip to my notes here to. So when does it occur? Highly cohesive groups, homogeneous groups, insulated groups, and groups operating under stressful circumstances. I don't know, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So that type of situation can breed groupthink. So absolutely, investment committees should be thinking about groupthink. The symptoms include overestimation of the group's ability, overconfidence. They include closed-mindedness or the unwillingness or failure to consider alternative courses of action, and also pressures towards uniformity. So you don't get the free and open discussion that you typically would get. And the outcomes are problematic as well. Failure to consider all the alternatives. This is an important one for this group. Failure to examine the risk of the preferred choices. For investment committees that are often dealing with risk-based questions, that's an important one. Failure to discuss all the information that the group has available at their fingertips, and also another important one, failure to consider contingency plans. You know, the what if, the what if discussion. What if this doesn't work? So that's essentially the consequences of groupthink. I'm going to throw a couple other biases out and then talk about how to deal with them shortly. But some of the other biases, I'll just add one thing on group polarization, because Jason hit that pretty well. It's, again, a little historical piece. It came out of what was called the risky shift phenomena. So psychologists found that groups made riskier decisions than individuals. But then, as they researched this further, they said, oh, no, that's actually not the case, because they said groups often made more cautious decisions than individuals. And what's going on here? It can go in both directions. But what it is the initial starting position. So if the individuals come to the group discussion with an initially risky view, they'll make a more risky decision. If they come to the table with a more conservative view, they'll make a more conservative decision. So that's essentially the mechanism that results in the polarization of group decisions. I won't say much on confirmation bias, but it's incredibly important. There have been a number of studies that show it's a robust finding that shows confirmation bias exists at the individual level, certainly, and also at the group level. And these days, it's just very easy to find information to support your perspective. So absolutely, you should be aware of that. I'm just going to throw out a couple other biases or things you should think about from an investment committee standpoint. Group size. So, what is the optimal group size for an investment committee? Research suggests that it's probably around 8 to 10. Why 8 to 10? Because at 8 to 10, you reap the benefits of the insights and the input of the members without having losses due to coordination. So it's a double-edged sword. As you go up, you get better, but then as you get too many committee members, it's harder to coordinate, and two, committee members don't feel like they're contributing in a very large group. So you get what's actually called social loafing, one of my favorite terms. So that's something to think about. Leadership, alluded to. So there's not a lot of research. Well, let me back off a second. There's a tremendous amount of research on the effect of leadership and groups. Probably enough to be a panel, Steve, if you wanted to consider leadership in the realm of investment committees. There just hasn't been a lot of research on investment committees. There are really three, but there's one finding that emerged from some of the research. There's really three types of leaders. They're the autocratic leader, who's basically going to listen to the investment committee and then make a decision. There's the laissez-faire leader, who pretty much just lets the committee, very little structure, lets the committee go about on its own and make its own decision. And then there's the democratic leader, one who will essentially vote. You have a voting procedure in place. There's really not there's not much research in the investment committee realm to say that one form of leadership is better than the other. One study did find that the democratic leadership style led to a significantly high level of satisfaction among the group members. So to the extent that you want satisfied committee members, the democratic approach would be your best approach. So I'll just talk briefly about 5 tips that you can use to improve the investment committee. The number one is absolutely diversity. In fact, I was at Vanguard for years, and before I left Vanguard, we were working on a paper on diversity investment committees, which actually came out in 2015, years after I left. That's how long it took to come out. But they have a nice paper on it. It's by someone named Catherine Gordon. So you should take a look at that. But diversity, and I'm not just talking diversity in terms of demographics. Of course, you want demographic diversity, age, gender, race, but you also want thought diversity, people who think differently. And diversity does a great job of dealing with the problems of groupthink. Diversity does a great job of dealing with group polarization. Diversity does a good job of dealing with social conformity, which I didn't talk about, but which Jason did. The pressure of the group on the individual is incredible, and there are a number of famous social psychological studies that deal with that. So that's really important. If you don't have diversity, assign a devil's advocate. Or bring in external people to a particular meeting, not committee members, but maybe consultants or specialists to offer up an alternative point of view. 2, optimize the size of the group. Don't keep it somewhere between 5 and 10, and you should be okay. I didn't talk about this, but publicize members' expertise. In other words, you could have a lot of expertise on your group, on your investment committee, but that expertise may not be tapped if other committee members don't know about it. So every time a committee member joins, a new committee member joins, hand out the CV or resume of everybody on the committee. If you don't hire somebody within a year, absolutely hand out the CVs and resumes at least once a year, because if the expertise is known and essentially authorized by the group, because the group is making it known, that expertise is more likely to be tapped. Number 4, make contributions identifiable. So that'll eliminate social loafing, and it'll increase satisfaction of the committee members. And the last thing I'd say is just educate your committee that they are fallible, that committees can fall prey to a number of different biases. With that said, I'll just say a couple words on the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. So the foundation is an offshoot of FINRA, the regulator. And the goal is to provide particularly underserved Americans with the knowledge, tools, and skills for financial success in life. We fund research on financial capability, financial literacy, and also investor literacy. And we also fund programs, financial education programs that we primarily administer through the United Way and the American Library Association. Happy to talk more about the foundation or even FINRA. Part of my work is through FINRA, the regulator, at any time afterwards if you like. And with that said, I'll kick it back.
Thanks, Gary. Just a quick question. Curious as to, given the number of committees out there across the board, and I know you have focused probably more, is it fair to say, on the retail sector of the investment business?
More in the defined contribution world, the plan sponsor world.
Okay, individual investments. But just curious as to why you think there hasn't been more good research, being a researcher yourself.
The main obstacle to researching investment committees is understandable, but it's that investment committees do not want researchers looking over their shoulders. So it's very, very difficult to actually engage in this type of research. The study I mentioned, I believe, was pulled from Form 5500 data, the 3,400 plan sponsors, so they didn't really need the help of investment committees. I know Hersh Sheffrin did a study on an investment committee that he looked at one investment committee, and that's more anecdotal, it's more qualitative, but it's insightful, and he points out some of the biases that he's another behavioral finance guy, and he points out some of the biases, but that's pretty much the hurdle. That it's just hard to get investment committees to agree to.
Thanks, Gary. Sally. Last but not least, I just want to mention, as Steve forgot to mention, I think that you've just received a nice award from Institutional Investor. Was that this past week?
It's tonight.
Oh, it's tonight. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks very, very much.
Yeah.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's very interesting to be following up Jason and Gary. My mind was racing around to many examples of investment committee meetings, discussions, decisions that could illustrate every one of the issues they mentioned, and I'm sure you can as well. And I'm also thinking about how could some of the prescriptions be put to work, and I'll touch on that, having heard them both now give their thoughts. But the biggest challenge to change and implementing good suggestions, at least for a nonprofit investment committee, is time. And I wasn't planning to dive into that at all, but time is so short. People are usually volunteers, busy people with their own work and perhaps other boards, and getting people to show up, having prepared for the meeting, read the materials, let alone go away and write a position paper and come back with it to share with the committee. I would love that, but how to make that happen, I think, is probably beyond my skill in working with the committees, at least that I know. But we could probably dive into that a little more at another time. If you're a careful observer of punctuation, you'll notice that the topic, today's topic, has a question mark at the end of it. Investment committee behavior, value created at the top, or not? So I wanted to use that as the basis for some of the thoughts to share with you this morning. Two things, governance and innovation, have become my favorite two ideas to share when somebody asks, what could we do differently to impact investment returns, boost performance? And innovation's a topic for another day. I love to talk about that as well, because innovation and money management don't usually go together. It implies you're playing fast and loose with the money on something that's not been tried before. But I would argue that it's something we all have to do. Still another topic for another day. But governance is getting more and more attention, and I think I'll say it's about time. We have very little research into investment committees, as you know. I think it's just a hard topic for many reasons. But we know we're in a low return environment. We already tinker constantly with asset allocation changes, manager hire and fire changes, using alternatives or not, risk budgeting, risk oversight, active or passive, U.S.-centric or global. All of these things that we go back to time and again and say, well, if it's not working out for us now, we should do it the other way, or we should go back to the old way, or whatever. We're constantly tinkering. The one thing we don't tinker much with or ask much about is governance and the quality of leadership of the investment process and investment policy coming from the top. And that, to me, is the role of an investment committee. So in my job, I'm the Chief Investment Officer of the endowment and also the retirement funds at Case Western Reserve University. I have a staff of 5 people that work with me and have for years. And we have an investment committee from our Board of Trustees that has oversight of everything we do, but almost all of it is delegated to me and to my staff. Our committee's official duties are to set investment policy broadly, to set benchmarks, to monitor results versus those benchmarks, and to set spending policy. That is in our university bylaws, the board's bylaws. Those are the committee's duties. And they're very broadly stated, purposely, but you can tell they cover everything in some way, every part of our work. So I work with the committee that meets 4 times a year for 2 hours. If we're lucky, we can schedule a conference call in between. It's often difficult we have a maximum of 10 voting members, and we usually run at 10. At the moment, we're down 1 or 2, but they're waiting in the wings. They'll show up by July. So I think that's a very big group, an unwieldily large group, and often we have moments when it's difficult to get to a quorum, not because people don't care, but because they're busy and the meeting happens to fall on a date they're not available. So all of those things impact my life as their chief investment officer every day. I've been part of 5 different committees as well so far in counting. It's work that really fascinates me. And it's so instructive to be on the trustee or the director side of the table, coming from the staff side. The perspective completely changes and broadens in how I present ideas for our committee's discussion and approval. And I ask that of all of my senior staff members to make it part of your career development, to seek a board position, a nonprofit entity, and there are many wonderful ones in our Cleveland community, and become a board member. You bring valuable expertise to anyone who has an endowment or the money that funds the nonprofit or funds the foundation. Extremely valuable, and I encourage it. So what we learned from that is that every investment committee has a culture or a personality, a blend of all the individuals around the table, overlaid with the leadership style of the chairperson. There are different labels for describing personality in individuals, and I was looking for a tidy set of them, and I found something that relates remarkably well to group personality and the behavior of an investment committee. Likes making decisions or likes to keep options open. Likes details, likes the big picture, makes choices based on emotion or makes choices based on logic. And finally, talks a lot as he or she thinks out loud, versus talks a little and thinks long before speaking. So those are the 4 things you can combine into a description of someone's personality, but I think they apply remarkably well to the groupthink of an investment committee. You could that may be a place to start the study of a committee, some kind of personality test. The decisions then of the committee absolutely, in my experience, affect investment outcome and achievement of investment goals, or inability to produce a good investment outcome or to achieve investment goals. So the work on making the committee as functional as possible is really a key driver of the results that everyone's after. I think orientation for a new member is a key starting point, and I really call it indoctrination. As much information as you can convey to a new member about the culture of the group they're joining, or perhaps convey that before they even decide to join. It may not be their kind of committee. But a new person, a new thought process brings new experience and diversity, and can also be a refreshing change. But the one thing to me that's most important to communicate to any new member and to the group as it exists today, if it's not already focused there, is an appreciation of the fund's investment goals, how those goals are stated, how they've evolved, why they may be and should be different from another endowment down the street, or the pension fund next door, or the foundation the new committee member is already working with as an investment committee member. It's all of these differ from group to group, fund to fund. They should. Different funds have different goals, different needs, different institutions, organizations have different risk appetites in their investment for their investment results. And I often say that investment policy should risk in investment policy should absolutely be integrated with the risk appetite of the institution the endowment or the pool of assets serves. So after all of that, I always say repeat, and remind, because everyone's busy, time's short. They may work on multiple portfolios, serve as board members in several places. And a meeting that it may convene only a handful of times a year doesn't allows too much time for important information to just leak out. You just forget it, you confuse it, you can't remember if this manager problem belonged to this group or to that group. I have it myself, so I have great appreciation for it, and I'm constantly providing background or picking up a discussion, reminding people where we are, picking up a discussion today, reminding them of where we left off at the last meeting. Years ago, a public pension fund I worked for hired Gary Brinson and his then firm, Brinson Partners, to manage an international bond portfolio. And Brinson had a practice that at the time seemed a little unusual to me, but today I remember it and I have great appreciation for it. Every time Brinson wrote a quarterly letter, provided a statement, a quarterly statement, or came in for a portfolio review, the page one of the deck they used had the same page every time. And that page one restated the investment objective that the pension fund had hired Brinson to produce, framed in big font in a big box. And to the best of my recollection, what we were doing at that time, the mandate always said, page one always said, Brinson's job for our client is to outperform the non-U.S. Solomon non-U.S. government bond index on a currency hedged basis over rolling 3-year periods. Very simple, very straightforward. That was their job. The rest of the meeting went on to talk about how Brinson had done in delivering on that objective and what decisions had driven the results. it completely defined the parameters of the conversation, just like a CIO talking to an investment committee or a consultant talking to an investment committee. In my Brinson example, it didn't allow room to say, well, how come your international bond portfolio didn't outperform U.S. bonds, or our hedge fund portfolio, or a spectacular real estate manager, or the S&P 500. That's where you get away from investment policy, and a committee discussion gets way off track. That one clear investment objective was the only thing that mattered. And I bring that, and that's your glass box, Jason, in the middle of the table. I bring that practice now to every meeting and every deck I produce for our quarterly report to our committee. We start off with, what are the investment objectives? I have 5 of them. That's a lot of objectives with one portfolio to work with. But they're there on the page, and on the top half and in the bottom half, we show the results and show the benchmarks, and then we go on to drill down into why that was the result, how we delivered it, and drill down into the portfolio into more detail. So this story easily transfers into my world in a multi-asset class portfolio like our endowment. It helps us. It could help a pension fund or a foundation portfolio as well. And it just is so easy to get off track, off topic, when all of these qualities of groupthink and begin to take over and steer a conversation away from what's the point. The point is we're there. We're all there together, the staff, the consultant, the committee, to meet our investment objectives. And if we've got good policy in place, we just need to remind ourselves to stick to it and not take out the hammer to smash the box. So it's really my single best suggestion, and something I constantly remind myself of. But there are a few things I'll leave you with. My list of what'll help us recognize the behavior that gets in our way and can help us get back on track. And I call it investment committee myopia, or some of them are traits right out of our behavioral finance terms that are guaranteed to get in the way of good decisions. One is the bias, blindness, or exclusive focus on a single asset class or a single favorite manager, and an inability to see the whole portfolio. That's what we have to meet the objectives, the whole portfolio. There are really few investment committee members who can wear that hat of the whole portfolio. And I said to Steve early this morning, and I wasn't going to say this, but he said, go ahead. And my contention is that often, not always, often, an investment committee member who comes from a single asset class, who may be a buyout fund GP, or perhaps a hedge fund manager, or is really attached to a specific product or asset class, they make the worst investment committee members, often, not always. They are singularly focused on that, and when the discussion comes around to something in that area, they're fantastic, but they cannot see the forest for that one single tree. And so that's, if that's you on your committee, think about it and try to broaden the perspective for the good of the whole portfolio. Another is transferring personal investment preferences to the institution's portfolio, and focusing only on return, without asking what risk was assumed to earn that return. The companion to that, focusing only on low risk without asking how to earn the return that's expected and needed over time. And another is focusing on results relative to a peer or a competitor without asking how the peer's investment goals may differ from yours. The one thing that drives me more crazy than anything else around our committee table, is where the first question out of somebody's mouth is, well, the school down the road produced this result. How come yours doesn't look like that? Or my favorite, of course, one of the very largest and most elite endowments. And the answer is not all endowments have the same investment goal. We assume that everyone's goal must be to earn the highest possible return at all times. And that's simply not the case. It shouldn't be the case. There should be something that addresses risk appetite, something in the investment goal that addresses what type of long-term return is needed to support this, to feed the spending distributions that the school relies on, or the foundation, or the pension fund's liability, whatever pool the money may serve. And finally, too much time is spent on where the market is today and where it's heading next. It's wonderful chatter. It's great. A topic is the weather for just chatting, but it doesn't lend itself to good investment decisions. And we spend way too much time on it, and it really leads to panic or exuberance at exactly the wrong moment. And then the group think takes over, and the collective decision and the focus on investment goals gets thrown out the window. So there's a really short supply of people out there that can think in this really broad perspective of a multi-asset class portfolio. They're really valuable. If you know them, find them, gather them onto your committee, into your organization. And if you serve as the committee member, take that out into your assignments and think from the top. And I hope the next time we convene that we can take that question mark off the end of the title and just say value creation at the top, period, and full stop.
We'll take that under advisement, too.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sally. Just a quick question on your committee. You mentioned diversity as your number one prescriptive item, but do you have non-traditional people on your committee? In other words, the faculty, students, people from outside the university?
Not so much. It would be one of my greatest wishes to improve that.
When you become chair, in other words?
Yeah, when I rule the world, it'll all work that way.
Well, I think we've heard how much of a challenge investment committee work can be. We've heard some good ideas as to how that could be improved, and I hope the research does pick up. Part of our job at Common Fund Institute is to look at the research that is being done for our industry and our clientele. So we'd love more company doing that, from academics or practitioners, whomever, committee members themselves who are interested. But the dynamics clearly are multifaceted, and we have to deal with them. I want to thank all three of you for your comments today. Let's open it up for questions to the audience, if there are any. And Bob.
I'm interested in each one of your view. Some of them it's implied but not clear to me as to who should hire and fire managers, staff or the committee.
Sally, want to take that first?
I think it really depends on the resources that are available. If it's a large enough pool of assets to have a staff, then make that the province of staff decisions in whatever role with the committee's oversight you may want to have. If it's a very small committee or perhaps no staff or a consultant, then unless you are fully outsourced and handing all discretion to outside fiduciary, then I would say the committee should be involved with the manager decision. It's often the most fun thing for a committee, that my same point about losing sight of what's the whole portfolio going to deliver for us. The manager discussion's the fun part, right? It's like a great little stock idea. You pick up a tip for your own portfolio. You get to bring in an idea from the fund down the road. But too much time is spent on that. Too many, I think, hire and fire decisions take place that shouldn't take place because it's kind of seductive.
Gary, Jason, you want to comment further?
I have nothing to add beyond that.
Okay,
Would capture it.
thanks. Other questions? Yes, Brian.
John, I'd like to ask the panel members, this has been a general discussion about investment committees without specific reference to the size of the staff. There are large institutions, small institutions. Many institutions don't have any staffs at all. So, I mean, how do you comment on that and what your choices are? Two small institutions can have staff, and that's to cut corners in how they manage the fund. What should they do or don't do?
Want to take that?
You should go first.
But my suggestion in that instance would be a fully outsourced investment office, or really, if the resources are that tight and small internally, have a committee that can thoughtfully set policy and find, if you can't have it internally, find an outsourced consultant, an outsourced CIO that can provide that externally. And again, the committee is there to oversee the results, not to tinker around the edges. But
yeah, I mean, I would, excuse me, I would add just one quick note, which is that I think what matters above all is the process and the quality of the process, not where it's carried out. It's how it's done is much more important than where it's done and who does it. And, you know, just getting back to the point I made earlier about, you know, a structured decision-making process. I mean, if hiring and firing is the main reason you need staff, and it may not be, but to the extent that it is, then somebody has to be measuring the quality of the hiring decisions, whether the inputs correlate with the outcomes. In other words, when we choose managers to hire, does it turn out with hindsight that we've chosen them on the basis of criteria that have predictive value or not? And when we're firing them, are we measuring how they do after we fire them to see whether we should have kept them? Unless somebody's doing that, it doesn't matter whether you have an in-house staff or you're outsourcing. There's something wrong with the process. And I know there are consultants who do some of those things, and there may even be some who do all of them, although I'm not familiar with them. But if you can't find an outside organization that will structure its process appropriately, then maybe you need to think about building it in-house if it's feasible.
The only thing I'll add to that is that, again, regardless of how the committee's formed or where it resides or how big the institution is, groups are groups, and they're susceptible to the same biases. One other point I'll make that hasn't come up yet is that an investment committee can make a good decision, a good process, no biases, that doesn't work out. And investment committees can, very, very dysfunctional investment committees can occasionally pick a winner. So it gets to this point of measuring, measuring what you want to measure. But keep in mind that you could make the right decision, and your committee can make the right decision. It might not work out. I like to quote Yogi Berra, but I don't know if he said it. If I don't know who said something, I just say Yogi Berra. But prediction is really hard, especially about the future. So it's just something to keep in mind, that good decisions sometimes don't work out, bad decisions sometimes do.
Brian, I'll just add that we've done a lot of research on the size and structure of committees in our research institute, and that you don't see many internal staffs until you're probably somewhere north of $500 million in size. And I'm talking about a staff that can handle a complex portfolio there, that has some alternatives in it with specialists on the staff. Many nonprofits, particularly, and many public pension funds are woefully understaffed these days and underpaid, which is leading to, and that's true in many public universities as well. The public sector is very difficult to work in for that reason. But committees tend to be somewhere around number of eight, about 8.5 on average in higher education, and somewhat less in foundations. But you get an idea there that if they're smaller than $1 billion, they may be outsourcing, as Sally said, to an outsourced provider now. And that business, of course, has grown very, very rapidly in the last 10, 15 years. So there is a solution for smaller endowments, smaller committees, smaller institutions that really need more sophisticated advice than the committee or the staff might, and if they have a staff. In many cases, they don't. So that is a solution.
And John, if I could add to that, I'm Phil Jarvis. I work with John in the Institute, Common Fund Institute. Once you get below, certainly below 100 million, in our research, more than half of educational endowments, and I think it's in the 40% of foundations, have substantially outsourced their investment function. So this is not a trivial thing. Trees don't grow in the sky. We're not saying it's going to be 100%, but it's a substantial and steadily growing, it seems, part of the industry. Those suppliers would be dedicated OCIOs, or as Sally suggests, implementing consultants. And of course, there's a range of discretion, there's a range of best practices, but this is just a kind of footprint that you can think about.
And that's when the outsourced providers hired, that presents a different type of challenge to the committee. Committee has to wrestle with how much discretion they want to maintain in their own hands, what's their relationship with the outsourced provider, how much reporting, et cetera. It's a governance challenge, and as Sally pointed out, but the idea there is to very carefully determine what governance model you're going to follow before you hire the outsourced provider, because those questions need to be answered.
If I could just add another, with respect to, I think, the high-performing university committee that Sally was referring to, that she irritated being compared to, one of their practices that's very interesting is that they constrain themselves with respect to the kind of decisions they make and when they make them. So, for example, at this committee, decisions about asset allocation, targets and ranges, and decisions about dissatisfaction with managers can only be made at one off-site meeting a year. And the staff prepares for that, the agenda is set, the discussions are had, the decisions are made, the staff is instructed, and then that issue is closed for the rest of the year. So the other 3 meetings are not devoted to people walking in saying, oh, look at the Wall Street Journal, we have to buy gold. It's basically they have disciplined themselves, so they force themselves to do this once a year and then close that box and lock it up again. And that's part of the procedure.
Another glass box.
Another glass box.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? We have time for one more. Yeah, Brian.
Just picking up on Jason's point on structure and discipline, that was really interesting. It seems like a lot of it comes back to that, being disciplined. But then Sally's point about just the time constraint right now. I'm just curious, and I've read other research about intuition. Are there any decisions where intuition is just plain old intuition is helpful, or really is it more about the structure and discipline?
Yes, and if you read Danny Kahneman's book, he talks quite a bit about this. Ever since Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, there's been a sort of social meme, particularly in the U.S., to idealize intuition. We think about Steve Jobs and other incredibly creative, innovative people, and we celebrate sort of the power of gut feelings. And it's extremely well known among psychologists what the conditions are under which intuition leads to good decisions. The intuitions of a professional athlete, for example, are extraordinarily powerful. The center fielder is moving in the probable direction of the ball before the batter often even starts to swing. And no one has to tell the fielder, no, run more to the right. Somehow the glove comes and the ball just lands in it. Those intuitions are incredibly powerful. And what makes intuition work is when the person making the decision gets prompt and unambiguous feedback, and the decision is consequential. So if you think about a professional athlete or a neurosurgeon, for example, those people know almost immediately whether what they did succeeded, when, if it didn't, it went wrong, and why. Very easy to tell because they have follow-up. But if you then think about something like the financial markets, I don't know, let's say you're Todd Combs or Ted Weschler and you work for Warren Buffett and you just bought Apple. Well, you're already getting feedback. You know, I don't happen to remember whether Apple is up or down since they filed their 13F. But if it's up, does that mean they're right? Or does it mean nothing? Tomorrow it might be down. 3 months from now it might be up. A year from now it might be down. It's all feedback, but it's very noisy and ambiguous. So the financial markets are not a very good place to get good structured feedback. So intuition there are areas of the financial market where intuition may have a role, but for a function like an investment committee that is making decisions about long-term objectives, I'd be hard-pressed to think of why you would want to rely on intuition. I think it's going to get you in a lot more trouble. And, even some of the examples in Blink that Gladwell uses to make the case for intuition don't really work because it's a very unreliable guide under many different circumstances. It can work beautifully, but a lot of the time it's misleading.
Thanks. I'll just read from Jason's book one more short quote for that to answer your question and to what Jason just said. In the short run, people who invest on the basis of heuristics, which is intuition-based decision-making, have all the fun. In the long run, those who invest on the basis of statistics amass all the wealth. Enjoy reading this volume. We've got a copy for you. As I say, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
To my panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Okay, a couple of housekeeping items. Connie is out, but she sends her best. And so we're planning next month's session on skill, right? It's part 2 on skill. And we feel that also is an area that there is almost no research on. I've gone through all the academics, and they say, great subject, I have no basis to talk. So it's very interesting. But I was talking with Michael Mobison yesterday, and he offered one other thing for this panel. He said that, on Brian's panel, that innovative session on big data, they use an example of Google. There's a lot of innovation coming out in Google, specifically with their Google Translate effort. But Google's done some work on teams and how teams, interact. He says what's probably useful for today's discussion is the fact that Google, there was a New York Times article about this, if you want to read it. Google has identified one of these themes that Jason, Sally, and Gary have picked up on, which is to have a safe house or a safety zone for each individual member to feel like they can contribute without having any retribution or anything like that. They're free to speak their mind. So that's one of the qualities of a good team. And Michael's written a paper on this about how good teams interact. So on the 16th of June, we'll have a session here. We've got 3 really good speakers. It was very difficult to find them. And it's skill as it relates to earning a fee premium. Okay, and after that, as the group historian, I do have to remind everybody that in our best practice white papers, we're very clear, Bob. Committees should govern, not manage. They should not be picking managers. And Rusty Olson is very clear on this, that the beauty contest and the bake-offs are probably one of the most disruptive things a committee can do. And that's all stated in our investment committee best practice that came out of John's session last year. And then more importantly, the OCIO movement. And lest it be said, passive is a very good way to go. In other words, picking an index fund rather than an OCIO. So that is a viable alternative for a small committee, and that's all in our best practice white paper.
Charlie Ellis would agree with you.
Vehemently. John and Bill, by the way, have a very good series up at Yale. They have an active passive debate with Charlie Ellis and Vern Sedlacek, and it's, let the fireworks begin. It's very, very good, and I think they've covered it well. And if Ray lets me, we'll hold a session on pure passive investing here coming in the fall, so stay tuned for that.
Maybe ETFs.
And that's Bob's big favorite, ETFs. On May 26th, we're going to hold a new member reception at the Indian Harbor Yacht Club as Ray works down his minimum. Sorry. And
Thank you, Ray.
But if you do have any suggestions for new members, please bring them to Indian Harbor, and we'll give them a little bit about what we do here. And finally, just to cap it off as a group historian, The Wisdom of the Crowds, the book that was written, really got its start here at the Roundtable in 2005. And in it, the late Peter Bernstein talked about the psychology of being a contrarian. And with that, he says, being a contrarian is being alone and wrong for long periods of time, and contrarianism is not for sissies. But he did say that crowds do make better, the crowd is usually right. And the crowd is usually right because they're independent, they're knowledgeable, they're diverse, and they have an aggregation mechanism that brings all their wisdom together. So that came here at the Roundtable about 11 years ago. And then finally, I just want to thank you, Sally, and Jason, and Gary for coming here today. It's really a pleasure, and thank you very much.
Our pleasure.